Ukraine wants to use long-range weapons to ward off attacks from Russian territory. Its Western allies are divided on whether that's a risk worth taking. Ukraine's president is pushing to use long-range missiles like British Storm Shadows or American ATACMS to target air bases and launch sites in Russia. But Western allies are hesitating in the face of stark warnings from Moscow. And meanwhile, Russia is again gaining ground in Donetsk and the Kursk Oblast. So we're asking, long-range weapons for Ukraine, Putin's red line? Hello and welcome to The Point. It is a pleasure to greet our guests. Morris Gottman reports from Ukraine for the German news magazine Stern. Nico Lange is senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference's Zeitenwende initiative. And it's a pleasure to welcome Alexander Burlikov. He is a professor of international relations and researcher at Germany's Leuphana University. And Moritz, we're 2 years into this war, and there is no end in sight at this point. Russia is stepping up its attacks on Ukraine's electricity grid, on utilities. Winter is drawing near. President Zelensky has long-range weapons in his arsenal, thanks to the U.S. and the U.K. Why can't he simply use them in self-defense to preempt the Russian attacks?
Well, basically because the West hasn't allowed him to do so far. These weapons, they are still, they are in the arsenal of the Ukrainians, but in order to use them, Ukraine has to somehow cooperate with its Western partners. And as long as Biden, especially Biden, doesn't allow to use them against targets inside Russia, Ukraine can't do so.
President Biden, Nico, in fact, met with the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and nonetheless, they discussed this issue, but no decision was announced. It seems that Biden is possibly more hesitant than Starmer. Did the hesitation surprise you, and does it play into Russia's hands?
It doesn't surprise me. I think that is the politics. Unfortunately, that's the policy of the White House from the very beginning. I think Biden is holding the British back. They want to be more forward-leaning on this. Some other partners, like the French, the Netherlands, Denmark, they have lifted all restrictions already. They are not even talking about it. But very much depends on the White House now, where I have the feeling the mindset from 2.5 years ago is still unchanged, but the war has changed very much, and I think there should be decisions taken to allow Ukraine to target by themselves and to bring more precision weapons that can be used for deep strikes into Ukraine. So it's not only about restrictions, I think it's also about following deliveries.
Just briefly to Biden's hesitancy, as I understand it, Biden can actually stop the UK from granting permission because Storm Shadows contain some U.S. parts. Is that right?
I think that is what already happened.
Alexander, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been doing a lot of saber rattling over the past 2.5 years. This is now no exception. He is once again making threats. How seriously should Ukraine and its partners take those threats?
I think how seriously this threat should be taken depends who you are in the alliance. To pick up on the point about the White House, this is a unique situation compared to Ukraine's European partners. In many ways, the U.S. is a global power with global interests, and the conflict in the Middle East is one where Russia is not only possible, but very likely to respond asymmetrically to lifting these restrictions. And we already know that the Russians considered supplying the Houthis with advanced long-range missiles of their own, and this is exactly the kind of escalation that we could expect to see should restrictions be lifted by the White House.
And I want to drill deeper on that point and what retaliation might look like. But first, let's take a closer look at what Ukraine wants and what its partners are willing to allow.
It's about missile systems like these, British Storm Shadows or American Attackams. Shorter-range versions are already being used by Ukraine, but the Ukrainian president is again increasing pressure on NATO partners to supply longer-range missile systems. The aim? To take out command centers and airports in the Russian hinterland. Prolonging the process of lifting long-range restrictions will lead Russia to move these targets further inland. Therefore, when the restrictions are lifted, it should be about Ukraine's victory, not just a political strategy. The release of Western long-range weapons is an absolute no-go for the Russian president. His threats are accordingly blatant. That would be a direct intervention in the war, and it would fundamentally change the conflict. It would mean that NATO countries and the USA are at war with Russia. How important are Western long-range weapons for Ukraine?
And let me put that question right to Moritz. Would allowing Ukraine to use these long-range weapons for the purposes it's seeking, would that actually make a decisive difference? Is it a game changer?
I would say that it could have been a game changer 1-2 months ago. But again, we are seeing that it's taking too long. Our discussions in the West are taking too long. And this gives the Russians the opportunity, for example, to move away from the border or from the zone of risk, to move away to other airfields, their warplanes that could have been hit with these weapons, ammunition depots, whatever. So actually the moment of surprise is over. And even if the West gave the permission now, it wouldn't have a decisive moment in it.
Staying with the question on game changers, a Ukrainian drone recently destroyed quite a large weapon depot in the Russian area of Tver. Could Ukraine use its homemade weapons, its own drones, to achieve the kind of cross-border attacks into Russian territory that it says it needs long-range missiles to do?
The Ukrainians could, and we see that they are doing this. And especially the cases you were talking about, it's amazing because Tver is really very far away from the Ukrainian border. It's even further north than Moscow. So it's amazing what they're doing with their self-made drones. But it's much harder to hit with these drones, for example, airfields deep into Russia, because the explosive power of these small drones, it's not as big as Storm Shadow or Attackams has it. So you may hit one plane or the other, but you can't do certain things with these kinds of drones.
Nico, for a good year and a half at least, critics have been saying Western aid is coming too late, too little, too piecemeal, and that what we really need is a big bang, a lot of aid delivered at one time. Moritz also implied the same. Would you agree with that? Would you say this piecemeal approach is simply prolonging the war and the suffering? Or do you think Western allies are right to be cautious?
I think the strategy that was driven by the White House mainly to deny Russia achieving its war aims worked. Putin did not achieve his war aims for more than 2.5 years. But the strategy we are in now is the longest possible and most expensive way of handling this. It will be much more expensive for all of us if we continue on that path. So I would not call it a big bang, but equipping Ukraine with what we would use ourselves to solve the military task, to put Russia under pressure on the territory of Ukraine, and lifting the restrictions of weapons. We would also not restrict ourselves if we would have to fight this fight. That would, I think, change the situation. And to do it faster is a faster way to put Russia under pressure to come to the negotiation table. dripping help in and then hoping for this to somehow solve itself, I think, is not a very good strategy.
Alex, in his final interview before leaving office, the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that he acknowledges there would be a risk to allowing Ukraine to use these long-range missiles. On the other hand, he said the greatest risk that we face is that Putin wins this war. Would you agree with that?
I think that this assessment is, broadly speaking, correct. For European security, also for global security, at the end of the day, and I've written about this, a Russian victory by the sword, as it were, would normalize a new status quo in international relations. So beyond the implications for our own security, this would embolden similar actions by other countries that want to change the status quo and that oppose the rules-based international order.
If I may add, the Ukrainians are in a quite desperate situation at the moment. As you mentioned, these attacks on the energy infrastructure will bring a very tough winter for the Ukrainians, the toughest winter of all over the last 2.5 years. On the conventional level, on the front in the Donbass, the Ukrainians are outnumbered.
I want to come back to the situation on the ground.
Basically, the West, if it wants the war to end, it must allow the Ukrainians to put some kind of pressure on Putin to bring him to the negotiation table. And they can't put the pressure on Putin on the front in the Donbass because there are not enough people. They can't do this on several other levels. So this level of the long-range missiles could be one measure where how they could put more pressure on Russia. One measure how to end this war.
So let's talk a little bit about whether and how Western allies could mitigate the risk if they were to proceed with approval for use of long-range weapons, perhaps separately rather than jointly. In his remarks in the report that we just saw, Putin appears to assume that the NATO allies would act in concert, Nico. But in fact, Jens Stoltenberg, who has just ended his term in office as Secretary General at NATO, said, no, it will be up to the individual countries. Do you think that that would make a difference in Putin's calculations, or is it perhaps too fine a legalistic point?
The bridges over the same river in Kursk Oblast were destroyed with French glide bombs. The French are not even discussing this at all. I think this is the right approach. The question is, why are the US and UK are discussing this out in the public? And I agree with what Moritz said, speed is of the essence here. And we saw with the Kursk offensive, I think the Ukrainian demonstrated it to all of us, that Putin and his system, they have huge problem with surprising events, with things that happen fast, but they are very good if we are acting slow. They are very good in adapting and reacting to it. So putting Putin on his heels and having the initiative on our side, I think that is what we are lacking. And the Ukrainians have showed that this makes the difference.
How divided are the Western allies, in your view? We've heard Chancellor Scholz here in Germany saying under no circumstances will he provide Taurus cruise missiles, longer-range missiles, for Ukraine's use. We have Biden hesitating, although he has said Ukraine must win. And then, as you say, we have France going ahead. Are the allies actually more divided now than in the past?
No, I would ask the question, are those arguments you mentioned, are they connected to the military situation in Ukraine? Because I think they aren't. It's about the elections in the US. It's about the SPD being under pressure from the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht. So it's domestic.
A new left-leaning
party. The longer you have those discussions, the more they are influenced by domestic nitty-gritty and are away from the military situation in Ukraine. And of course, Putin with hybrid warfare has instruments to even take part in the domestic discussions to undermine a quick response. I think that is what we are seeing here. The best way is not to talk about it and not have discussions and just deliver and let the Ukrainians decide what and how they do it.
Alex, would you agree with that point? And in your view, how is Putin calculating this risk? Would it make a difference if countries simply moved ahead, as the French have done, rather than debate at long length whether it's okay to give permission?
So I would strongly agree with Nico that this is essentially driven by domestic political considerations. And I think that that also means that when we look at Putin's statements, they are part of this hybrid response because they are meant to elicit a certain fear of these measures in Europe, in particular. Not so much in the United States, but certainly in continental Europe. And I think it's worth remembering that the public-facing statements of the Kremlin and what the Russian military would actually do and the Russian security services in terms of responding to this are very different. And the kind of escalation that is likely to come, for example, sabotage, more hybrid warfare, escalation in other theaters, as I mentioned, in the Middle East, is likely to come anyway in the near future because of the necessity for the Putin regime to actually win the war. And this is part of that strategy, regardless of what we do.
Hanging over this war since its inception has been the Damocles sword of a possible nuclear event, the use of a tactical nuclear weapon by Russia, for example. Is that something that would be on your list of possible retaliatory tactics that he would use?
Absolutely not. Russian nuclear doctrine is very clear under which circumstances this would happen. It's very clear about the ladder of escalation and how it would proceed. And essentially, if one assesses it realistically, the only circumstance under which the Russians would consider to use a nuclear weapon would be if the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation, and here it's very murky what they mean by that. Crimea, potentially. The rest of Ukraine, clearly not. So if the territorial integrity, and more importantly than that, regime stability and regime survival were seriously threatened, which is not a scenario that we are likely to see in this conflict.
But talking about territorial integrity, I mean, the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, isn't this the case of a...
So
that's exactly where we're going next. But go ahead, Alex, please.
So the way that they think about it is not that of a threat to territorial integrity, but when territorial integrity becomes compromised in a way that cannot be salvaged by conventional military forces. The Russian assessment of Kursk is that it can be contained with the forces available to the Russian military. And therefore, this does not actually compromise irreversibly Russian territorial integrity. Therefore, it's not grounds for escalation.
And there is a cost calculation on nuclear weapons as well. I think in Germany, the debate is very illiterate because nuclear weapons are understood like an end-of-the-world button. Yeah. But I think in the Russian understanding, after the use of a nuclear weapon, there is a day after. And there is a discussion on what this would mean. And that makes it, for Russia, I think, highly irrational to respond in that way.
Absolutely, yes.
Let's come back to the incursion into Kursk. And this, in fact, is quite a different type of cross-border attack that Ukraine launched in August when it sent troops into Russia's Kursk region in an attempt to halt and divert Moscow's forces. An embarrassing surprise for Moscow, but its counteroffensive is now exacting a high toll.
These images are said to show Russian military in the Kursk region. Russia claims to have recaptured several villages. A month after the surprise invasion by Ukrainian troops, the counteroffensive is underway. There is talk of fierce fighting. But the Russian army also appears to be advancing further on the front in Donetsk, albeit slowly. Many civilians had to flee the particularly contested area around Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian defenders are under pressure. Contrary to Kyiv's hope, Russian units were not withdrawn en masse from Donetsk and redeployed at Kursk. With a possible Russian reconquest of the region, the idea of forcing Russia to exchange territory is also threatening to fail. Fighting in Kursk, on the defensive in Donetsk. Did Ukraine miscalculate?
Moritz, what would you say to that? Was the Kursk incursion a miscalculation? And what effects did it have that are positive for Ukraine? Morale boosting, perhaps?
I think it's too early to assess, finally. But you are right. It boosted the morale of the Ukrainians. It showed to the Ukrainians and also to the Western partners that Ukraine can surprise the Russians and can take territory from the Russians. But so far, it didn't reach the main aim, the main goal, which was to draw forces away from the Donbas region, Russian forces. The Russians are countering the Ukrainian offensive in Kursk region. They have stopped it, but without using forces from the Donbas. And in the Donbas region, the Ukrainians are very much under pressure.
Alex, clearly this is not the major territorial invasion that you meant a moment ago. Nonetheless, in fact, Russia was forced to resettle refugees who left some of the towns that had been captured by Ukrainian forces, and it did declare a state of emergency in the region. What will that have meant to Russian morale?
I think that just like the counteroffensive last year, what it means to Russian morale has to do with how the fighting proceeds. And it must be said that the first 2 days of the incursion were very successful for Ukraine with deep penetrations by mobile groups. But the Russians mobilized quickly and they contained the advance of Ukrainian forces. And so the morale dip for the Russians was therefore essentially prevented by the relatively swift containment of the offensive.
Nico, beyond the Kursk campaign, how precarious is the situation in Ukraine overall? Reporters on the Eastern Front say that the Ukrainian forces there are badly outgunned, outmanned, and definitely demoralized.
Let me say one sentence about Kursk first. I
Yes,
think
please.
we are observing very modern warfare understanding here by the Ukrainians, because it's a kinetic action that supports the information operation, and the information operation is necessary to have a political discussion. And we always tend to have a tendency in thinking the other way around, but I think that's actually a super modern approach by the Ukrainians, and it will have an effect on all the discussions we are having. At the same time, in Donbas, near Pokrovsk, I have been there several times. People fighting there in the trenches are about my age, so they are in the end of their 40s. They are undermanned. 20% of the units are only filled with people. And it's a very tough decision by Ukrainian military leadership to say, look, we use the resources to go into Kursk, but at the same time we know that there's a difficult situation in Pokrovsk. But we will see later if this was a good decision to put the resources that way. I think we will see now increasingly also for Russia, that Russia has a dilemma in deciding where the resources go. That Russia did not put troops from Donbas into Kursk Oblast yet does not mean it's not going to happen. I think we will have to observe this over the next months.
Nonetheless, Russian resources are pretty impressive since Russia put its economy on a war footing. Alex, you recently did a study together with other researchers for Germany's renowned Kiel Institute for the World Economy, and basically showed findings that Moscow in 6 months could produce as many weapons as Germany has in its entire arsenal. Does that spell disaster for Ukraine?
So just to be clear, our findings are relatively consistent with other estimates from the United States, from the UK, and so on. So it's not that they're revolutionary in some truly dramatic way, aside from the comparisons that we make to the German context. But they do come with several, let's say, qualifiers. This surge in Russian production is very significant, and it means that Russia can remain combat effective, and it means that Russia can retain the initiative and continue the offensive in the Donbas. And I think it's worth mentioning that negotiations, should they ever happen, would only realistically happen the moment that the Kremlin assesses that its offensive power is spent. Until then, the Kremlin will not negotiate. However, can this last indefinitely? That I don't think so.
Nico, very quick answer, if you would. The German chancellor has recently called again for a stronger diplomatic push to end the war. When is the right time for political talks? Is it now?
I think the right time to start political talks should be paired with very concrete plans to supply Ukraine with weapons, because only then can Ukraine go to the negotiation table from a rather strong position. At the moment, the position of Ukraine is quite bad, so it's not the right time at this moment.
Alex, Donald Trump says he could end the war in 24 hours. If he were reelected, what would that look like? Ukraine loses?
I think Donald Trump says a lot of things, and I think whatever he says at his rallies will be moderated by the American national security bureaucracy and would come to a much more, let's say, realistic outcome.
That's an entire discussion in itself. Very quick last question to all of you. Long-range weapons for Ukraine, Putin's red line. That was our question. Should the West give permission? Nico?
Give permission, deliver more, expand the deliveries. That's a way to peace.
Alex?
It's something that has to be done. Will it be a game changer? Unlikely, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done.
Lawrence?
I think the West should do this, but more than that, there should be a clear strategy.
Thank you to all of you for being with us. Thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Check out our YouTube channel. Tell us what you think. See you soon.